It's that philosophical change from playing defense to saying, okay, how am I going to proactively protect organization at all levels, as was mentioned, both from the senior level executive team to then the operational team? What are you going to do? And having a plan for that. We still found that that's definitely a mental switch for a lot of organizations because they're so busy with the budget they have, as you point out, to do what's already been on the budget last year, which was on the same budget the year before, which is going to be on the same budget next year. And there's not a lot of room for growth. It's a tough spot to be in for sure, but trying to anchor that conversation as a CISO in your strategic plan, as an IT director in your strategic plan, you need to talk about cyber resilience for the organization and what that gains you managing through the attack. Like, how is your company going to withstand an attack? Right, that should be a question that CIOs and CISOs should be asking their board and their executives. How do you think we're going to sustain an attack? How are we going to manage through it? And when you get the deer in the headlights look back, there's your opportunity to say, we might need to think about a budget plan here, folks, to a little bit every year to make sure we're covered. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about operational resilience and incident response, particularly within the healthcare industry with some of our guest speakers here, and what their background and expertise are. I'm Jeff Hancock. I will be the moderator and co-speaker here this morning or this afternoon. I've been in cybersecurity for almost 30 years, originally in special operations and the intelligence community. Retired out of that, and I've been a CISO for 19 years across a variety of industries. So to kind of set the stage for our conversation, in particular as it relates to cybersecurity and healthcare, last year we saw a 22% increase in healthcare data breaches, over 2022, which is pretty significant. It still leads the industry verticals as one of the most breached industries that we've got in the U.S. And globally, the number gets even bigger. Since January 2nd of this year, there are 74 current ongoing investigations of cyber data breach attacks within the healthcare industry that the FBI is currently conducting. That's a fair amount of currently ongoing investigations that are known and publicized, not to mention the ones that aren't publicized that obviously for other reasons no one's going to talk about. But it's an interesting statistic, right? We've all heard of Change Healthcare and what's gone on with them. And the issues and challenges around what they're trying to deal with. As of Monday, some of you may know this, so Black Cat was the group that was identified as the one who's conducted the attack against Change Healthcare. System compromise, so far as in the investigation goes, systems have been compromised as far back as November. Yeah. And that's still under investigation, but that's what the FBI has come up with so far, which is not unusual from a cyber attack perspective. Bad guys are usually in networks 4, 5, 6 months before they're discovered, which again is a big challenge, right? You wouldn't know it. 123 systems were compromised within Change Healthcare. These are systems and platforms, is how we've got it, as how the FBI has defined it. Systems for Medicaid, as an example, those are hosed up. Pharmacy systems, or as we've a lot have heard in the news, those are issues. Device or practices, medical practices, are also being damaged or delayed as far as providing healthcare because of this issue. So it's a pretty far-reaching breach, which underscores the challenge of being able to not only secure your own assets in your organization, but then your supply chain, right? So gone are the days of thinking about what you're doing in security from a broad perspective. If I just make through the next audit, if I just make through the next review from our board of directors, whatever the case may be, that we're going to be successful going forward. Right? As we've all heard this for years and years, right? You're easily breached if you're not following some basic cyber hygiene, which everyone should be doing to begin with today, right? Things from multi-factor authentication, encryption, using antivirus, anti-malware, a variety of tool sets that are available to organizations, healthcare organizations to use. Always the challenge has been certainly not enough resources, human resources, or not enough understanding of the environment, of your environment, of the healthcare environment, and how that looks. How do you secure that? How do you work that? So it's an ongoing challenge, ongoing problem. What we're talking about today, though, is a little different in that what do you do when you're breached, right? In the industry, broadly speaking, so many, now outside of healthcare, including healthcare, I should say, the defensive posture, defensive approach that so many organizations take. Again, nothing to say security awareness training doesn't work. It does. Nothing to say that Making sure you've got antivirus, you've got your systems encrypted, you're using multi-factor. Those are great things to do. That's table stakes. That's cyber hygiene. That's like wash your hands before a meal. You just do it, and it does help. But the bad guys also know that. And so they find ways around that. So they have that advantage, right? Their goal is to keep breaking in. Our goal is to keep protecting, right? So there's always that challenge. But what do you do when you have a breach? Do you have a plan for when you have a breach? So thankfully, what I've noticed in the last few years is there's been much more of a focus area of how are we resilient? How do we navigate through? Now, from a CIO's perspective and a CEO's perspective, there's disaster recovery and COOP and DR, so disaster recovery and continuity of operations for organizations. Those are typically based on managing the business through natural disasters and the IT support of those things. But not a whole lot of attention has been given. It's increasing now, but not a whole lot of attention has been given to the operational side of cyber resilience. What does that mean? Making sure you've identified your key systems, making sure you know what is going to be attacked in your organization. Not too hard to figure out, but it just requires a different mindset, a different framework. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm joined by Jeff. You want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. Glad to be here. I'm Jeff Ulinet. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Financial Officer at Atlas Health. For the past 35 years, I've focused with large corporations, founders and investors on digital transformation. It's an unusual role, as you probably know, to transcend both finance and technology. And that's why cyber resilience is one of those topics that's so interesting, because as we all know, just because you've laid out a plan doesn't mean that your CFO is going to fund all the attributes of making that happen. And in cyber resilience, it's a lot about governance. So it is people and process, as well as componentry. It's not just defense, it's offense. And it's also our ability to anticipate where these threat vectors might occur. And so my role is to ensure that there is an adjudication across technology and finance, and ensure that the company puts the emphasis on the right syllable as it grows.
My name's Rick Live. I'm Chief Information Security Officer for Field Services for Access Point Technology. I run all of our advisory services. I've been in this business for about 35 years now. I've spent better part of the last 18 as a CISO or an ISO roles, working with small companies, large companies, large healthcare organizations, brought defense in-depth methodologies, zero trust methodologies to organizations across 6 continents, 144 countries. So we've got the big experience, and we've also got a lot of the little experience, which is kind of fun. The mom and pop shops bringing it in healthcare, especially where they can't afford to do a lot of these things. They don't understand where a lot of cyber resilience, what it really means. They're thinking, okay, I've got a HIPAA compliance checkbox. I've hit that checkbox. Mr. CFO, you know you have to pay for this, but we don't know anything else. So what we do is we come in and we help them actually bridge that gap, understand where their failures may be, and we help to understand and guideline and write things out for the strategic plans for the organizations and help them get to where they need to be and build out the strategic plan.
So a bit of experience on stage for sure. So did you want to go over the cyber resilience definition?
Sure. So the whole point of a cyber resilience, right, is to be able to detect when something's happening. You have to be able to respond when something's happening, because during an incident or during an event, the last thing you want to be doing is scrambling, right? You've got to have that predefined. You've got to be able to have that be able to recover from the incident or event, and then you have to adapt. So what happened? How do you adapt? How do you make modifications so this does not happen again? How do you push this out across the organization so that you can reduce your cyber impacts, right? It goes beyond the simple cybersecurity measures. It goes beyond firewalls, goes beyond access controls. It goes much deeper into actually understanding your assets, your business impact analyses, going in through your risk assessments, understanding what those turn into a risk plan. And you're going out to your risk register and then getting your risk treatment plan and then tying that all back to what you just learned. It's an incredible tool.
So we're going to dive into questions. Feel free, ask questions. In small room, so if you guys have any questions, by all means, let us know. Not a problem. We prefer the engagement, actually.
Yeah.
So first question to one or both of you, however you want to manage that. So operational cyber resilience within our healthcare facilities. How would you do it? How would you approach it from your perspective?
From my perspective, it's about getting the team together. So I go back to, and I've been on a lot of podcasts lately, And people get tired of hearing, sometimes I'm constantly pouncing the basics, right? So the bad guys know what we do as a checkbox. So if you've got a HIPAA compliant organization, you got a PCI compliant, GDPR, ISO, they know what your minimum checkboxes are, right? So, and that works great if you actually do them. A lot of times we find there's a lot of fundamental and foundational pieces missing. And so we go back literally and start talking about how can we gap this analysis, or how can we understand where our holes are at by doing the BIAs, doing the risk assessments, and then bringing that back to the strategic plan. So we do a lot of identification of your critical assets, because a lot of companies flat out don't know where their critical assets are. How many IoT devices do you have on your network, and how many services run those devices? And what happens if those fall offline or go offline for any reason, right? Our protection measures, everybody's got anti-malware, antivirus, that type of thing out there. You've got your access controls, potentially. Get your response plans. And this is the one thing that I try to harp on a lot, is because I see a lot of failure in smaller organizations, especially larger organizations, even more so. So in the incident response plan, one of the things that I always try to tout is to really don't do it once a year. First off, do it at least twice a year. Try to do 4 times if you can, but at least twice a year, and get the executives involved. Get the C-suite involved, because the minute you build an incident response plan and the executives are not involved, you don't have their backup, you don't have their support, they don't know what's going on. So the first thing that's going to happen when an event or an incident occurs, the CFO is going to be going, oh my God, what's going on? They're going to talk to his favorite engineer or director, and then everybody's scrambling. So we try to make sure that we go through response plans. Everybody knows what everybody's doing, when to expect updates, what to expect each team to be doing, so that things work on muscle memory. So that's what we want to do it 2 to 4 times a year. And then your recovery strategies. So if you do, unfortunately, get hit with malware, or if you do lose a cloud platform because you've got yourself somehow into vendor lock, right? How do you recover from that? How do you move forward? What strategies do you use to get back online? Because security is a patient safety issue, right? So how do you get back online quickly? And what did you adapt from that? And what did you learn? And how are you going to push that out? Once you understand all that, then now you can build out your resilience. So you know where your failures were, because let's just be honest, if Home Depot, if the FBI can't keep China out, we're all going to struggle with it as well. So having that recovery strategy and that resilience culture is critical to the organization.
Yep, agreed.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think this is a great list. I would just say that what we see, and we're starting to see in healthcare writ large, is questions that come from customers. How do you anticipate failure? What is the governance body? We know that the new NIST standard really focuses on governance. And the way I look at it is that governance is really part of the product going forward. So when you sell a product, you talk about security standards, you get questionnaires around compliance, but now they're starting to turn their attention to the resiliency part. And what they want to understand is that there is people, process, and infrastructure that's devoted towards coming back from a problem and anticipating that problem, and that the culture, as Rick said, that permeates the entire development of your product, anticipates the fact that you could have bad actors that are attempting to penetrate. The other thing I believe that's critically important and we need to understand here is that this evolving threat is not necessarily one whose intentions are to take you down.
Correct.
Some of these threats, this new vector around machine learning and AI, is really intended to manipulate an outcome. It's much more significant in decision support and in the clinical space, but even operationally, if the intent is to alter an outcome, we have to look beyond just normal penetration and look at data sources and code to understand where, in fact, that penetration could happen. And if you're not continuously testing, you don't have a feedback loop in your product, whatever that product is, there's a high likelihood you're going to miss it. It's just going to happen. And then one day you're going to say, wow, that outcome is not really what we expected. And I think ultimately being on guard in anticipation of how those penetrations could happen, how they could manipulate your outcome, whatever that product outcome is going to be a big part of what resilience is, and it's built into the product.
So that's interesting. So that's talking about the bias of the data potentially, or the individuals just making a simple mistake, and then having that follow all the way through, and then having the resilience and the checks and balances. Are you referring to also having the checks and balances along the line, along the way in your ML to make sure that your ML outcomes are correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the news over the last couple of months, we've seen examples of ML and AI that's been manipulated to produce a false outcome, imaging, an image as an example, that never took place in the real world, but it took place inside a machine. Just extrapolate that to a clinical outcome, and you can see the danger that's apparent. The danger could be from within, cultural bias or some form of bias, or it could come from the outside, the data source itself, the way the ingestion point of that data works, the teaching that's done on that ML language, the questions that you can pose to an AI engine. All of that has the potential to manipulate an outcome. It's a much more complex vector than I think we've ever faced.
Yep, I agree. That's a really good point. Even for the organizations that aren't working on a product per se, right? You're just doing operations, healthcare operations. Is AI, is machine learning, and I prefer the term machine learning versus AI, quite frankly, because I don't think we're there yet for AI. But my point is, for organizations, healthcare organizations, who's using machine learning processes? Who's using GPT or other platforms to be able to try to streamline what they're doing, right? That's a risk. One, is there some governance around it? Is there some control around that? What other systems is it touching? But I think both of these guys really mentioned that the idea here, and you've got on the screen. So NIST had this created, the cyber resilience framework 14 years ago. And we've had it for 14 years. Not a lot of people are aware of it or use it, right? But the first one there goes back to what they were talking about, anticipate. What are you anticipating within your organization as a threat, as a potential threat? What are the weaknesses? What are the areas you need to really focus on? What stories and outlines do you need to create for your organization that identify the top 6, 8, maybe 10 high-risk areas, and then what you're going to do about it? So that's the key thing about cyber resilience in your organization, is identifying where the threats are coming from and what's vulnerable in your organization. And then obviously, do you have the skills to withstand it, right? If an attack happens, and this is the key differentiator between defensive posture cyber operations and more proactive posture of cyber operations. When an attack happens, under withstand, what are you going to do? How is your team going to respond? Certainly the playbooks and having tabletop exercises are critical, but making sure you've got the right data to go after things. Making sure your vendors, whether you're buying a product, a third-party product, or you're developing your own, that's a key aspect of it. How are you making sure your vendors are secure? As in, again, Change Healthcare. See what they're in the middle of and their supply chain issues, right, that are being uncovered now. That's become risen to such a high level of attention in the government. I don't live too far from D.C., and this is a topic of conversation in Congress right now. They're getting involved with this healthcare breach because of the leading implications that this means. And there's been talk and conversations about this healthcare being a critical infrastructure sector, like critical to the national security and capabilities of the U.S. government, which is, there's some truth to that for sure. But it's gaining a lot more visibility and a lot more curiosity from the political side, which is good and maybe not so good, depending on how you look at it. We don't need regulation. But there's some serious things that we need to consider. So as people who are involved in security operations to some degree, your organizations have something going on, has that question been posed? Right? What are you doing from a resilience side to make sure when a breach happens, what do you do? Whether it's a direct attack through you or whether it comes through your supply chain, what are you going to do? You don't need to boil the ocean, but coming up with a good plan is really important. So second question, what key elements should be included in a healthcare organization's incident response plan? Both under the AI component for sure, what you should and shouldn't do, but then also under operational resilience and how that applies.
Yeah. So again, IR plans and roles are critical, absolutely critical. You've got to get everybody involved that's going to understand what's happening, when it's going to happen. To me, that's just the basics, right? That's your absolute very basic right off the bat. Understanding how you classify your incidents and making sure the team understands how you classify it, how you prioritize it. So when something does happen, how do you classify that? What really is most important? Because I've led teams through incidents where 2 or 3 different things were going on, and they didn't realize that until we started going through the process, that we start noticing something different going on, which was pretty interesting. The first time I'd actually had to do that myself, that was really interesting to chase that down. But understanding those two, if nothing, walk away from nothing else, understand those two basic pieces, right? That's critical. Understanding some of the other tools with other, like detection and analysis. What's going on? How are you detecting it? Where is it at? Is this analysis correct? End user behavior analytics, your network analytics, your anomalous analytics will help you greatly. So there are a lot of products out there that work on the network to do that. But when you start looking at a lot of these products now straight going to the cloud, because let's face it, everybody here is in the cloud at some degree, whether it be a private cloud, public cloud. So now we've got to get these analytics out to the cloud. And so that's one of the systems that we need to really work on well. Your recovery and your retention. So those are the things we have to look at.
So on the AI front, what do you think?
Well, I may or may not talk about AI in this particular topic, but it's very clear that these kind of detection activities is very use case based. It's also a function of the stage that the company is in. And so it is not unusual for me to come into a company and see a topology that looks like a constellation. It's got so many nodes, it's got so many servers, it's got so many attributes that over years were built up and created threat opportunities. That doesn't just happen, right? It happens as a function of scaling a business, trying to be extensible. It very much exposes you if you're not careful. And so the exercise for me is often, where are we today? Where do we want to be tomorrow? And if we're still building a product, how do we control additional threats that can be driven by the fact that we're continuing to code, we're continuing to add nodes or attributes to a product? Because what you don't want to have happen is a year or two after fixing up your topology, you install a good knock and sock and everything looks good. But over time, as you build that product out, engineers are adding new things. And so the resiliency test and the governance body, I think, is really critical to catch that on an ongoing basis, that feedback loop through your IS&T group and in coordination with engineering has to be really, really tight. Because if you're like me, you roam these halls, you see tens of applications that can add value perhaps to your own product. But anytime you add them, you are introducing perhaps a new vector inadvertently. And so that ongoing test, I think, has culturally got to become part of what we do, especially as these ecosystems within healthcare are born out to be a series of apps that you splice together in your stack. You have to be super careful that your group isn't developing products that inadvertently create exposure.
That's where adding risk assessment is part of your actual change control. For every change comes into play a lot of times. So we've seen a lot of customers in the same scenario not do that as part of their change control. They'll go in, and then 3 years later, you've got this monster and this beast, and there's been very little risk analysis done on each of the changes. And then before you know it, like you said, Jeff, you've got this massive problem, or you've got a small problem that's going to create a massive problem somewhere else within the organization. So adding that risk assessment to your change control processes actually helps stop a lot of that right up front as a proactive measure.
So what do you think, in your experience, Jeff, with the groups you've worked with, who should own the resilience idea, solution, concept?
So the idea of controls across departments is something that finance drives as a matter of course. As an example, in accounts payable, the person who sets up a vendor can't pay a vendor, right? Otherwise, there's the opportunity for fraud. In the case of engineering, IT, and security, for me, the CISO needs to stand alone as an independent assessor of the situation. And if you're in a growth size company, the ability to bring in the proper expertise at that stage is really difficult to stomach financially and operationally. And so companies like Atlas at this stage will use an organization like Access Point to kind of augment the staff and provide that independence. CISO, who is doing documentation, who's looking at this at a higher level. And then IS&T within the company is charged with making sure that the NOC and the SOC work effectively.
What role do you think the executives in a hospital administration would provide regarding oversight? I mean, COOP and DR, disaster recovery and continuity operations, I'm sure there's a method to manage that within the organization. But when it comes to what do you do after a breach? How do you manage through a breach? I mean, what are your thoughts there or experiences there?
I think that what we are all seeing is that it's inescapable that the way we conduct business is to use very complex stacks of hardware and software to accomplish whatever that task is in healthcare, whether it's in acute care setting or it's in an application platform like Atlas Health. And so I think it's inescapable at this point that we've passed an inflection point as a society where the C-suite is incapable of understanding how actually the business is conducted. And that level of expertise in the C-suite is now evolving because, well, frankly, people who grew up with computers are much more savvy. And they are rising to the C-suite levels, and they bring a completely different view on technology and its implementation in healthcare. So I want to believe there's much, much more sensitivity. I think we're in an interim period where the level of technical sophistication varies, but within the next 5 to 10 years, I would imagine that it will be assumed that if you were in a C-suite capacity in any healthcare organization, you're going to be able to sit on a stage and talk about your cyber resiliency.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's nice to see that happening. I'm just curious in that process, how things have grown over the years. You know, I agree with your point about certainly how the CISO should stand alone, but also work with engineering, but to try to provide some sort of objective point of view. Still not easily digestible for a lot of organizations. So
it's not. It's very difficult. That's one of the tenets we stand on. Is we always try to work with our organizations, our partners, and our clients, and help them understand why there's this push to separate out the CISO these days from IT. Because plain and simple, we all know IT is judged on time up. Can I come to work? Turn on? Does it work? That's it. That's really their goal. From the security perspective, breaking that out and saying, okay, that's great. We need to have this online. We need to be able to use it, but be able to protect that even from ourselves. That perspective comes in and makes it more difficult for IT to do their job. Because as Jeff was alluding to, the devs will come in if there's unchecked and they're going to get flat. They're going to make it quicker. You're going to make it easier to work. Great things. But if we're not protecting our organization, not protecting that data or having the ability to log that interaction, that becomes extremely difficult. So
I would group it all kind of in asset allocation, right? From a finance perspective, one of your C-suite's primary charter is to figure out where they should place their bets financially and operationally, people, process, systems. And if you have a more technically savvy C-suite, there will be no arguments about where you place security for your engineering and IT infrastructure, because it'll become apparent that it's part of the product you're actually delivering. It's inseparable from actually what your customers are expecting from you. And so it should be prioritized differently now than it used to be.
Agreed. So with that in mind, from both of your perspectives, what would be the top 3 things, let's say, that an organization should do when it comes to cyber resilience, but either from a tactical hands-on perspective or a strategic board perspective? Like, what are 3 things you could recommend that you need to think about, you need to look at, just consider?
Well, we all know how budgeting is done, right? And invariably, the security aspects of a business is one of many things to contemplate when you're building a budget. And if there's a high value revenue opportunity, the money tends to shift there. It's a natural thing. Or cost savings, or improving relations with labor. whatever the objective, the primary objectives of the business are, be it nonprofit or for-profit, there's a set of objectives that the CFO and the CEO, they're trying to fund adequately to ensure the outcome that they want. So the question becomes, where does cyber resilience rack and stack in that list of things that you need to accomplish, given you have a fixed amount of money to spend towards it? So oftentimes these exercises turn into intellectual ones. And I can sit with Rick and talk about cyber resilience, but the reality is, if our budget doesn't support the people, process, and systems, the governance requirements, the time away from other work that the governance bodies will need to spend, it becomes difficult to execute upon. Because at the end of the day, if the money isn't there, it's not likely to get done. So it's a prioritization issue. I do think we're in this transition period, as I said earlier, where the C-suite is beginning to understand that underclubbing in cyber resilience is not going to behoove you as a company.
One of the largest things I've seen is I try to work with our clients and actually make that cyber resilience part of their business continuity policy, because that's really where you're going to go to. That's where that's your playbook when things go sideways. So adding on to Jeff, if we're not making profit, for profit or nonprofit, doesn't matter. You're still going to take our baseball bat and our ball and go somewhere else because we're not going to be there, plain and simple. So prioritizing that and prioritizing those dollars and prioritizing those products and prioritizing those strategic objectives over the next 12 months and break it down by quarter, that's critical. And so by working with, breaking it down by the quarter and then making sure that we still work with the C-suite to ensure that our cyber resilience is still on track, we're still following where the organization wants to go, that's critical. Because if we start branching off, now we're creating different issues and we're not accomplishing the goals of the business.
Right. So. I think that we found that it's easy to be able to prioritize IT systems, engineering systems from a healthcare organization perspective, and then looking at what do we need to do to protect ourselves from a security perspective, just to, like I said earlier, check the box, which could be anything from, anti-malware, and implementing multi-factor, whatever the case may be, real simple stuff, which is great. But again, as I said earlier, it's that philosophical change from playing defense to saying, okay, how am I going to proactively protect our organization at all levels, as was mentioned, both from the senior level executive team to then the operational team? What are you going to do? And having a plan for that. We still found that that's definitely a mental switch for a lot of organizations because they're so busy with the budget they have, as you point out, to do what's already been on the budget last year, which was on the same budget the year before, which is going to be on the same budget next year. And there's not a lot of room for growth. So it's a tough spot to be in for sure, but trying to anchor that conversation as a CISO in your strategic plan, as an IT director in your strategic plan, you need to talk about cyber resilience for the organization and what that gains you managing through the attack. Like as we had up on the screen earlier, or now actually, the withstand piece. How is your company going to withstand an attack? Right, that should be a question that CIOs and CISOs should be asking their board and their executives. How do you think we're going to sustain an attack? How are we going to manage through it? Right. And when you get the deer in the headlights look back, there's your opportunity to say, we might need to think about a budget plan here, folks, to a little bit every year to make sure we're covered. So any questions from the audience? Yep.
When you're framing things out, trying to communicate to that C-suite, how do you level set risk to the company in terms of, Jeff, you talked a little bit about, trying to decrease revenue or work on the monetization side, but then there are a number of other areas of risk, sort of compliance, data. How do you create a communication platform that would resonate to all of the different heads of the company that sort of level sets the risk to the company, whether it's monetary or compliance risk, or customer data risk? How do you sort of equate those different imperatives?
So obviously, I believe that the connective tissue between finance and technology is such nowadays that they're inseparable. And so the strategy of the product and its security profile are also inseparable. And customers, in our case, hospitals, are keenly aware of that. And so the questions that we get now in RFPs and just in conversation are often around governance. They want to know compliance. They want to understand how we approach security. They want to make sure we've got all the componentry in place. But they're also much more keenly aware of the fact that the culture of the company needs to support this whole idea of cybersecurity and anticipating problems. And this is manifested in the last couple of months in and around machine learning and AI, where there have begun to be expectations about governance around AI, primarily because of the examples of bias that have been surfaced in the press. I don't think we really fully understand the power of this technology to produce an outcome that we did not anticipate. It is just now evolving, and I think our threat prevention is going to expand, and I think the vectors are going to expand. And so your C-suite has to be keenly aware that they're working in a new world. They can't be blind to it. It is happening whether we like it or not. And anytime we introduce a self-learning platform, whether it's fed by our own data or external data, there's the opportunity for a penetration to produce an outcome that we did not intend it. We did not intend. And it could be good or bad. But I want to say it's easily manipulable because it isn't, but you can see where those vectors can occur, and helping your C-suite get aligned with the rest of the technology stack and where money has to go to support its protection. I actually don't think it's going to be that hard going forward, simply because of the number of examples that have appeared in the press. But I think we're right at that inflection point right now. I think it's starting to happen.
So some of the things I've seen that work well, communicating that risk to the C-suite so they understand where their dollars are going and what their priorities really should be, or where they think their priorities are, and then they realize something different. I go back to simple basics. Get your CISO dashboards up. What are your risks? You should display those risks in several different areas. Not all the details, but displaying the risk, your red, green, blue, as a basic in your IT department, in your C-suite areas. Explain that. Put that on a ticker in a private web page. Then some way that you can communicate every minute of every day. They can go click on something. They can look at something. They can see where they're actually at with the different pieces of their security cyber framework. Because one of the things, you don't want to just go for compliance. And C-suites and boards are now just starting to, understand that compliance is not security. It just isn't. And if you do the minimum to be compliant, you're probably going to be breached sooner rather than later. And if you do just the basics, you're still going to lose a lot of money because of the fact that you're now downtime. Your reputation is going to take a beating, even though breaches are going to happen. How prepared you are matters. And having that C-suite understand where you really are with your risk assessments, your risk treatments, what have you, understand all that in a simple, quick dashboard is very, very informative for them. And then taking that to your board of directors once a quarter, once every 6 months is a great thing. Because now the board actually sees at a high level in short order where, what's really happening and where do they need to reprioritize when necessary.
Question?
You have the BCISO as an option, as a service. I'm curious what kind of circumstances or what kind of businesses are going to best benefit from a BCISO and somebody who's not in-house.
Good question. Yeah, good question.
So I'll address that because I run advisory in our organization. So we do two things with our BCISO service, right? There's really two services. One is a use case where Jeff Atlas Health, he's one of our customers. He's smaller. On bringing you somebody with 20 years of CISO experience is very expensive. It's not cheap. It's not. So bringing somebody in, and also if you keep bringing somebody in, they won't stay very long because they'll get bored out of their mind, right? Because it's too small, it's not enough challenge, et cetera. They don't have the budget to go do the things that they want to do. So bringing in a vCISO in that scenario can help you come in and then understand the business, understand the goals, and then help you build a strategic plan that meets that specific company's goals over a 12-month period of time, or their security is involved. That's one use case, and that's a very common use case that you see out there. The effectiveness goes back to reporting, in my opinion, because if you've got great reporting, now you've got great business relationship, you've got great business alignment, right? So as long as that alignment's there, you'll do well. Now, the other half of that is now where we're starting to see where we're doing CISO advisory work. So maybe a company is at that SMB, that medium-sized business. They have that younger CISO or that less experienced CISO, where now they need to come back and look at someone like us and help them bridge that gap between themselves and the board and actually help educate them and help them understand and grow, right? It's also a great second set of eyeballs. We had a bank come look at us just recently. We had really good discussions. Large bank, medium-sized bank, but they needed a CISO advisor. And it was a fantastic conversation. We started off with a vCISO discussion, and it turned into the CISO advisory role, and it was fantastic. So we see a lot of that now starting to come around. So instead of telling you how to do everything, we're going to take over, we're going to run it. That's not at all what we do anymore, right? A good vCISO comes in, understands the business, understands the goals, and then can build that strategic plan along with 4 steps, right? Every 90 days, where are we at? Have your checkbox, have your KPIs, KRIs, and match that up.
I would just say, for those of you that are golfers, you watched the Arnold Palmer Classic this past weekend. He used to have this great expression, something like, the road to success is filled with construction. And we all know that as we're building platforms. And so it's very use case specific for me. What's the stage of growth? What's the capital position of the company? And what are the threat vectors that they're likely to face? And to craft the security apparatus and the people around it. So a virtual CISO presents one viable option in that road to success. In some cases, it works perfectly. In some cases, you need kind of more involvement. I happen to lean more towards having my CISO as part of my dev activity. I want them at bare metal up. I want them to understand the stack. I want them to fully understand what we're building. I think they can do a better job, whether they're in-house or virtual. It is largely a function of how much activity is happening in the engineering side to know really how to size that CISO side of your business.
To add on to that, some of the experiences we had over the years regarding vCISO work, at the end of the day, companies who want that kind of assistance and support, one, can't afford a full-time, as has been outlined, but 2, it's a viable option because of the level of experience. When you look at cybersecurity broadly from a roles perspective, there are not very many people who have actual hands-on CISO experience, whether that's engineering and operations or GRC work. So there's a gap there, but there's a whole lot of companies who need that help and support. So being able to find the right CISO to be able to come in and help support that, both again from that strategic perspective, but then from the technical perspective, as Jeff outlined, is important. I think to the questions that were comments that were made, being able to know where you are in that growth plan in your organization and when to bring a CISO in and how and wherefore is a critical strategic direction. But tying that to our conversations today, cyber resilience is, that's a foundational thing. So boards should be knocking on the door saying, who's accountable, who's responsible, who needs to do this? Because it's not us, clearly, as the board, right? And do we need to go hire a CISO as an employee and fill all that out? In some cases, depending on how big the business is, that could be a very viable solution. But that's something to consider and to think about, right? Even companies, personal quick reference, MGM. We hold that a few months back now when they were breached. Very, very large breach, very downstream activities regarding extra costs, over $100 million. For a casino, okay, that might be chump change. But point is, they realized in that process, working with the board, they realized within that process, the folks they had doing security wasn't enough. The maturity level wasn't enough. They needed to hire people who had actual hands-on experience. That forced them to go back to their strategy and plan and say, as an organization, to your point, where are we and where do we hire a CISO, or should we hire a CISO, and where does that fit within our organizational plan and structure? And they got busy, right? And they're still walking through their process now, but you don't want to be in that situation, clearly, right? No one does, so.
The other thing where the vCISO can help or CISO advisor can help is you're working with an MSSP. So they should have They should be backed by 100 engineers. They should be backed by all of your all their different experts. Absolutely. And if you don't have that currently, a good vCISO will be able to pull in a partner potentially where you do have gaps when you need help. So they should be able to help identify that and then help identify some resource, whether it be compliance resource, it be a security resource. Maybe it's another CISO, help you actually go out and, okay, it's time to hire that CISO. Let us go help you find that, or we'll interview. We take different roles in that as well. So having that ability to reach into that technical depth and that additional staffing depth is helpful for a good vCISO.
So one last question here to these guys. So how can healthcare organizations balance the adoption of innovative technologies with the need to protect patient privacy and compliance with regulations? So from a resilience perspective, how can an organization do that?
So from an organizational perspective, you can't duplicate everything. We all know that. That's not going to happen. However, getting your cyber resilience out in the cloud is going to be helpful, making sure that you're prepared for it, make sure that you've identified all your assets, make sure that you've gone through the risk assessment, make sure you've gone through the business impact analysis, understand these things, and then communicate that to the board. That is the best thing you can do, in my opinion, to keep your resilience up, because without Jeff's approval, without Jeff's buying off on the money, it's not going to be there, plain and simple.
Yeah, I don't think that question is a new one for healthcare, right? We've been dealing with HIPAA and other schema that we've had to be compliant with for many years. And what's fascinating for someone my age is to watch this evolution occur, because we're all very, very sensitive to PHI now. We've been sensitized by the compliance regimens that we've had to comply with. And that's a good thing.
Yep.
The question before us really is a different one, I think. It is, how does this new technology, machine learning, AI, and some other technologies that have emerged over the last couple of years, how does that augment our notion of patient privacy? Because we're all in pursuit of trying to utilize data properly with the objective of producing a better clinical outcome, or a better operational outcome, or financial outcome. And by doing so, we inadvertently create the opportunity for problems. And I use the word inadvertent because I think most people come into this all with the best intentions, right? And so the question before us, I think, is, as a healthcare industry, where do we think the potential vectors are likely to be? Can we work together to thwart them, to ensure that there are protocols in place across healthcare? Not suggesting bureaucracy. I'm suggesting a common approach to the way we teach ML engines about clinical data, as an example. And there are lots of industry organizations who are attempting to accomplish that. I think before that happens, there is a high likelihood that in certain use cases, that we will use data in such a way, inadvertently creating an outcome that we did not anticipate.
Yeah.
Not because we wanted it to go that direction, but because the underlying data had attributes or bias that we did not understand until we ran them through an ML engine, and it produced an outcome. And what we know is that they're continuously learning, right? And when you continuously learn, sometimes you learn to veer left or veer right.
Yep.
And in there lies danger.
So hopefully this was beneficial to everybody. We really want to try to just sow those seeds, put the guardrails in place about talking about this cyber resilience to your board, to your IT teams, to your security teams. We believe it's certainly, as we've talked about today, something that's much more proactive that you've got to start considering in IT operations and cyber operations.